We're good at transitions. We're really good at that. We work those out and spend a lot of meetings planning transitions, and we nailed that one. Nailed that one right there. So glad you're here this morning. I know this is a busy time of year, and I appreciate you making this a priority to be here because there's a lot going on. Yesterday, there's a kid in Oliver's class. If you don't know who Oliver is, if you saw over here, he was the one who does some sort of jazzercise situation to the worship. If I worshiped the way he did, man, I would never have to exercise again. Like I'd be real fit. It'd be great. But he was the one that was getting sweaty doing that. Oliver's in his 4-year-old class right now. He's in half-day preschool. And so there's a girl in his class, and her name is Fallon. And Fallon had a birthday party yesterday. Now Fallon's birthday is December 27th. Our daughter's birthday is December 26th. So we have a heart for people who have to deal with that because your birthday is not going to compare to Jesus's. It's just, you're going to lose that battle every time. Like, do you invite people to Jesus's party or to your party? They're going to go to Jesus's because they get more presents for themselves. So they threw this party yesterday, and they were like, and so Fallon had a birthday party, and so we decided to go because we really have a soft spot for kids with December birthdays, and because it was at Celebration Station, and they were going to pay for it. And we were like, yeah, we'll go to that. Yeah, we'll be there. Can we bring both kids? And so we go to Celebration Station. We get down there, and we get there, and the party, it's like 10:30 in the morning, and they've got the pizza set up at 10:30. Like, this is going to be great. This is going to go really well. So we're eating pizza at 10:30, and we're hanging out in this upstairs room. Then they turn us loose, right? So they give us cards that are like tokens for the games. They give us these wristbands where we can go out and play, and do all these different things that are outside. And Oliver almost can't take it in. Like, it was almost too much for him. So he runs downstairs, and there's all these arcade games. There's all these flashing lights. He's like, Dad, do we get to play these? And I was like, yeah, we do. He's like, okay. So he starts playing them. And a little girl next to him named Olivia apparently won the jackpot of all the tickets in the Celebration Station. She got like 1,000 tickets, literally. She won 1,000 tickets, which I think is good for a down payment on like a balloon or something at these places. Pretty sure is what that's good for. But she won like 1,000 tickets. So Oliver's like, can't take it in. He's like, so we get tickets? Yes, we get tickets. We get to play the games? Yes, we get to play the games. And then we walked outside for a second, and he could not take it in. He was like, Dad, there's bumpy cars. Yeah, there's bumpy cars, bud. That's bumper cars. Dad, there's bumpy boats. Yeah, there's bumpy boats. And then there was the thing that they put you in the harness, and they make you jump up and down on the trampolines, and you flip around and stuff. He's like, Dad, can we do that? Yeah, we can do that. There's a roller coaster. Yeah, there's a little train that goes around in circles 5 times. And he was like, Dad, do we get to do all the things? And I was like, yeah, we do. He was like, and we get to play the games inside? Yeah. And we get cake? Yes. Like, it was the biggest day of his life. He could not take it in, all the things we got to do. So we went to the bumpy cars, and he had the time of his life. And then we went over to the thing where he was supposed to jump and flip around and stuff. And he basically hung there for a while, and he had a great time doing that. It kept him still for a little bit. Then we went to the bumpy boats. We got to the bumpy boats, and there's two little knobs there. If you don't know how it works, you sit down, and one of them steers you, and the other one just squirts. You have a button to squirt. And as soon as he got in the boat, the guy's helping him in the boat, and as soon as he gets in, just got squirted. Oliver just grabbed the squirt knob, and the poor guy was drenched. I was like, sorry about that. Can you help us with the train that goes around 5 times? We need some help over there. So we had this big day, and Oliver could not take it in because every time we get to do something, he'd go, and we get to go back inside and have cake, and we get to go to the bumpy boats, and we get to go to the train. And this word "and" became like our whole day. Yes, you get to do all the different things, all of them, and you get to do all of them. And is like a big word. It's a really exciting word. We like and. Right? That's like this time of year, we see and all the time. If you buy one and you get one free, if you buy one and you get one 40% off, if you go to Costco, you just get lots of ands, right? You get the one you bought and the other 46 pianos in that pack or whatever it is, because nothing comes in a single pack there, right? So you have and all the time. We love and. If you grew up like I did watching Schoolhouse Rock, you know about conjunction junction. And you might say, what's your function? Well, my function is hooking up words and phrases and clauses. And that's what and is. And is a conjunction, and it puts two things together, two things that are no longer separable. It puts them together, it fuses them together. It's a conjunction that does that for us. And we sometimes think of it as a small word, but it's really a really big word. And has a lot of connotations. And the great thing about and is it's mandatory, but it can also be really messy. And can get us in trouble. And can take us to places we didn't know we were going to go yet. And when we don't finish that sentence, we don't put a period at it, and can add in some confusion sometimes. It can get more messy, but it's also mandatory. We need and so we've been looking at this passage at the beginning of John, looking at Christmas through a different lens, not looking at it through the traditional nativity scene, not looking at it through the normal telling of the story, but looking at this scene through John's account, John's point of view. See, John has a very different take on Christmas and how Jesus came to earth. And so what happens is when John writes his, he's writing his much later, and the followers of Jesus are starting to get a little bit discouraged. The gospel's still spreading. People are starting to get to know each other, and they're still growing the gospel. But at the same time, the church is starting to struggle a little bit. Matthew, who wrote the first gospel, Matthew's been burned at the stake at this point, and Paul has been beheaded, and Peter's been crucified upside down. Things aren't going super great. And so some people probably came to John and they were like, John, you were with Jesus. Like you were there with Jesus. You walked with Jesus. You were there. Can you write something about what that was like? Could you tell us what it was like to literally be in Jesus' posse? Like you were Jesus' squad. You were everywhere he went. You were selfieing with Jesus. You were being tagged in the locations he was at. You were with him at all times. What was that like? Could you tell us about that? And so John writes his gospel. He writes his version of the accounts of Jesus. And his gospel is totally different than the other ones. He includes so many different things that aren't in any of the other ones. And we've been looking at just the first 5 verses in this preamble, basically, that he writes. Now remember, this preamble, this prologue, is the first 18 verses. And again, John may not have written them right up front. He may not have written them the first time. He might have actually written the entire book and come back and said, I think I need to include like a little bit of a prologue, a little bit of something to ease you into this story. So he writes these first 18 verses. So we've been kind of focusing on the first 5 verses, and we've been kind of spending time on these, which says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We've spent a lot of time on that verse. In fact, like 2 whole Sundays just on one verse. I'm really sorry. You're lucky we don't just go straight through the Bible at this church, because, man, we never get through it, like ever. Yeah, we spent 2 weeks on that passage alone. But then it says, he was with God, so the Word is Jesus. He was with God in the beginning. Through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now we're going to talk about that more on Christmas Eve. But then John kind of goes through this little piece of the prologue where he kind of meanders around a couple different things, and he gets really deep, really great stuff. But he comes back to this idea of the Word. And we come back to the Word made flesh in verse 14. And he comes back to this line. He says, the Word became flesh, just like we just sang. And what child is this? It says, hail, hail, the Word made flesh, right? And he says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Now, this line right here is really great. He made his dwelling among us. Now, when it says dwelling is not like it's not like a habitat or a home. It's not like a dwelling like he just came and he was kind of here. This dwelling is the word tabernacled. It's a very informal term. It actually means God came and camped out with us, is really what it means. Like God came and suddenly was hanging out with us. He was just there. I love the way the Message puts it. In the Message, Eugene Peterson translates it this way. He says, the Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. I love that. The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. So he says the Word became flesh and it dwelled among us. Suddenly he's dwelling here with us. He's hanging out. He's in the neighborhood. And then he says, and we have seen his glory. Now this isn't we as in like we or me and we or even he and we. It was just we, meaning like the disciples. Just we, just a few of us, have seen his glory. He's saying there was something different with just a few of us that were around Jesus all the time. We have seen his glory. We saw something different about him. We have seen things that you might not fully understand. We were with him all the time. We have fully seen his glory, and now I want to tell you about that. I want to tell you what just a few of us saw. I want to try to explain it to you because it was different. There was something different about Jesus that we want to try to explain. And just a few of us saw it. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Grace and truth. Now, I love it that he says he's full of grace and truth. Now, to be clear, what he's saying here is he's not saying that he's full, meaning like he has equal parts of both of them. He's not saying it's a balance that he has. He's saying he is 100% full of both grace and truth. They are inseparable. You cannot take them apart. He is full of both. It's not just about balancing them. It's about that he is full. He is 100% both of them. The math may not add up to you, but that's the way Jesus worked. He was 100% full of both grace and truth. Now, we all know how that works, right? We all know grace. Okay, so grace is the whole idea that you're forgiven for things, right? You're forgiven. And that's what grace looks like. But truth, we know truth too. Truth is the you're accountable side, right? Like it holds you accountable. Maybe you're like me and you were brought up with parents who one would be named Grace and one of them would be named Truth. You would know which one was which and you knew at which time to go to which one, right? You know exactly how that works. Maybe right now you're parenting kids and one of you parents is Grace and one of you is Truth, right? And right now, Gracie's getting poked by Truth. Like, that's you. You're the pushover, right? You know how this goes. One of you is usually Grace. One of you might be more Truth. That's how this goes. You know how this works. We have kind of this idea of grace and truth where they're kind of not synonymous terms. They work in opposition to one another. Maybe you've been at churches where that's the way it goes. Maybe you've been in a church where that's the way it works for you, is it's a church that's full of one of the two. It's a church that's full of truth, or it's a church that's full of grace. It's very hard to find that balance. We have a hard time with that. I grew up in a tradition where our church would have been much more truth-filled than grace-filled. That's the way that would have worked for us. And it's a balancing act. It's both. See, what happens is when we start to fall into one or the other, we miss out on the best parts of the other area. When we start to just focus on grace, we miss out on the great parts of truth because there are great parts to speaking truth, aren't there? To hearing truth. Truth is necessary. When we start to focus too heavy on truth, we miss out on grace. See, grace without truth is just lazy. Grace without truth becomes lazy. It becomes a walk, you're getting walked all over. It becomes you forgive everything and you never, ever correct anything. And it becomes lazy. That's grace without truth. But truth without grace becomes legalism. It becomes, let me tell you what you need to do. Here's how you stay in the right standings. Because every single one of us at some point in our life have needed truth, and every single one of us at some point in our life have needed grace, right? We've needed both. Both are very important. But we live in this world where we sometimes think we have to live in a different type of world where we don't have both. My brother, he worked at a Chick-fil-A when he was in college. He called it the Chicken Hut. And he wasn't very good at working at the Chicken Hut, to be honest. One of his first days, my brother's a big man. He's about 6'6". He's like 400 pounds or so. He's a large fella. And he's had some chicken himself. And it's good. You trust guys like that, though, with food, don't you? Like, you know what you're talking about. I'll go with what you say. And so he's working at the Chicken Hut, and he would, like, the first few days, like, he did a really bad job. And he was standing outside, and they wanted him to do samples in the mall. And he didn't want to do samples in the mall. And so he was like, how do I just do a terrible job of this so they never ask me to do it again? So he's standing there with his samples, and some people didn't take them. Who doesn't take Chick-fil-A samples? People. Don't know Jesus. And so he's standing there with the samples, and there, people are coming by, and some people didn't take the Chick-fil-A samples. And he was like, hey, ma'am, don't you want a sample? And she was like, no, thank you. He's like, no, you want a sample. Don't you want a sample? Don't you want a sample? I think you want a sample. And before you know it, he is going up the escalator after this lady. I think you want a sample, ma'am. He never had to do samples again. That's how you get out of that right there. Also a good way to lose your job, possibly. But they needed him for some reason. And so he didn't do a great job in his first few days, but there was this one woman who came to the counter within the first few days, and she stood at the counter, and this little old lady, she came in for breakfast, and she looked at the menu, and for some reason she came to a chicken restaurant, but she ordered the breakfast sandwich without the chicken on it, just the sausage and the bacon deal. She comes up and she looks at the menu and she says, I think I'm going to have the breakfast sandwich with sausage or bacon. My brother was like, would you like sausage or bacon on that? She goes, I would like the breakfast sandwich with sausage or bacon. Well, which would you like, man? Would you like sausage or bacon on that? Listen, son, I would like the breakfast sandwich with sausage or bacon on it. Yes, ma'am, I understand that. Which would you like? Would you like the sausage on that or the bacon on that? She literally turns him around, this 400-pound dude. Son, look at the menu. And he looks back, she goes, I would like this breakfast sandwich with sausage or bacon on it. And he had to look at his manager and be like, can I just give her sausage and bacon? He was like, yeah, just do that. She got the one and only sausage and bacon sandwich that they ever made. See, we live in this world where we sometimes confuse the two, but sometimes we have to choose. We think we have to make people choose or. We have to choose or, grace or truth, sausage or bacon. We have to have one or the other. We can't possibly survive with both happening simultaneously, right? And so we do that in churches. We do that as individuals. We think somehow I have to be the truth patrol and get out there and tell people about truth, or I have to be the grace patrol, where I have to get out there and just extend grace left and right, where we don't see this as a balancing act, where Jesus himself came full of grace and truth. He was full of both. Both things simultaneously existed within him. And we sometimes think we have to be one or the other. That's not how this works. See, Jesus didn't work like that. He didn't do that on a regular basis. It concerns me because we try to push churches and church leaders and Christians and all these different people, we try to push them to the point where they have to make this big blanket statement where they choose one side or the other. We do this all the time. I was just recently reading, and you know, this is one example that really bothered me. I was reading this recently in a Christian magazine. They were interviewing one of the pastors from a prominent church, a really big church, and they were asking him to make a blanket statement on homosexuality. Tell us what you think. Tell us, is it right or wrong? Is it a sin? Is it not a sin? Where are we at on that? What does your church believe? What is your stance on that? And I felt so bad for this pastor. I really did. They're trying to get a soundbite for a magazine. They're trying to sell magazines based on what this guy says. And he did a good job of kind of playing the field on that, just kind of saying, here's what I believe, but here's what we say and different things. I thought he did a good job. But they were trying to make him one or the other in a blanket form. Jesus very seldomly made blanket statements. He had a lot of conversations. I mean, the one time he's pressed on which is the greatest commandment, what does he say? It's love. It boils down to love. Love your God and love your neighbor. Love each other and love your God. It's love. And that's the commandment. Everything else is conversations. Because there's times where he extends grace where we wouldn't expect it. There's times where he says truth where we wouldn't expect it. By the way, that really bothers me because I think people in multiple communities, but the LGBT community right now, 87% of people in that community have come from evangelical churches. They grew up in evangelical homes, 87%. 76% of them have left the church, which is actually way lower of a number than I expected. 76% have left the church, but only 13% say that they left because of theological reasons. They didn't leave because of the truth. They didn't mind the truth. They could handle the truth. It was the grace. It's both. And there are some things that we don't talk at all about with truth. There's so many things that we don't say a word about when it comes to truth. We don't talk about some of these other issues that somehow we need to talk about with truth, where we talk about whatever it is, alcohol or sex or different things. We don't talk about these things. We focus on certain parts of truth. But then there's other times where we don't focus enough on grace, where we're not extending people grace to come to know Jesus. See, it's amazing to me how Jesus handles this situation. He does it so well. I mean, he does it time and time and time again, doesn't he? I mean, John is the one that records so many great moments of Jesus. But there's moments with Jesus. Remember where Jesus, he shows up, and he shows up with this woman at a well, this Samaritan woman. He shows up at the well. And what does he do when he sits down with this woman? First of all, he looks her in the eyes. A woman, a Samaritan, and he looks her in the eyes, but he doesn't, and he meets her with grace there, but then he brings truth into the conversation. And he says, where's your husband? Well, I don't have one. Yeah, that's because you got 4, and you're living with another dude right now. Boom, like, Jesus, you don't say that. Did you go, like, have you ever been a pastor before? You're not allowed to say that stuff. He just like lays it down right there. Yeah, it's because you got a whole bunch of husbands and you're living with another dude right now. He calls her out on it. He calls her out in truth in that scenario. But there's other moments where he extends grace that you wouldn't expect with Matthew or with different disciples, where he pulls in a tax collector to become one of his own. I mean, when he's hanging on the cross, one of the most confusing moments with Jesus ever. He's hanging on the cross next to a thief. Now, this wasn't really a thief, for the record, okay? Like, we get the term thief from what this criminal word would be, but really, they didn't hang thieves on crosses. That's not how this worked. This was the worst of the worst that were getting crucified. It wasn't just anybody. It wasn't like, well, that guy took a couple apples, so we better hang him on a cross. No, you had to really have done something. And Jesus is hanging on a cross next to a man, right? And one of the guys, he looks at Jesus and he's like, we're getting what we deserve, huh? And Jesus is like, it's kind of funny because Jesus doesn't argue with him. Like, you'd think Jesus would be like, oh no, you've got a great heart, kid, and you're going to do well in life. I mean, not long, but you're going to do fine. You'd think he'd extend the guy grace. This guy's like, we're getting what we deserve. And you'd think he would be like, really graceful. He's like, nope, you're pretty much right. We're getting what we deserve here. And then he looks at the other guy, and the other man hanging on the cross looks at him, and he's like, remember me in your kingdom. And suddenly he wants to go with Jesus into heaven. And it's like the guy's just trying to hit a buzzer beater here. Like, dude, come on now. Like, you're about to die. It's not even like you could do a rededication of your life at this point. Like, what's that going to do? I can't even move. It's not, what's he going to, like, get down off the cross and real quick, like, be like, see, I lived really good for those 5 minutes. Let's get back up there. I mean, what are you going to do with this guy? And at that time, Jesus says to him, surely this day you will dine with me in heaven. He extends grace where you don't expect it. He extends truth where you don't always expect it. But he balances the two. John captures the greatest story of this, and I won't go into the entire story, but he captures the greatest story of this in John chapter 8. You know this story if you've been around church, if you've been around, you know this story. The thing I love about this story is that it sounds like Jesus. There's a story of this woman caught in adultery, and she's brought to Jesus, and she's laid at his feet, right? And this story actually was not in the original text of John. It wasn't in the oldest manuscripts we have of John, of the book of John. It's not included. This story is not in there. But you can actually see this story scribbled in the margins in Greek. It's scribbled down the margins, this story of this woman caught in adultery and brought to Jesus. And for a long time, when this book was being canonized, people would get together and they would argue about this story and say, should we include that story or not? Do we include this story because it was just scribbled in the margins? Do we include it or not? And the reason they included this story, I love this, is because they said it sounded like something Jesus would do. It just matched his character. This sounds like Jesus. This is his reputation. This would be something Jesus would do. And you know the story where Jesus is there and he's being questioned by these different religious leaders. And so what they do is they catch him in this test. They try to catch him in his own teachings. And so they bring a woman who's been caught in adultery, and we don't know who she was caught in adultery with. We don't know where he was at because by law, he should have been stoned as well as her. But we don't know who he was, so probably, chances are high, she was framed by somebody. And they bring this woman in and they throw her at Jesus' feet. She probably still is not dressed. And now all of her shame that was once private is now made public. She's laid at Jesus' feet, right? And the religious officials ask him, the law of Moses says we should stone her. What do you say? Now, Jesus could have, first of all, been kind of snide with him and said, well, actually, Roman law says we can't stone her. So deal's off, guys. Good try. But he's like, no, let's play your game. Let's try that. And then what does he say? He says, yeah, we can stone her. So you, without sin, cast the first stone. You without sin, you go ahead. Don't hit me. I mean, I'll just be watching. You go cast that first stone. And it says that the oldest to the youngest began to walk away. And I think there's a part of that that's so interesting where the oldest leaves first. Older people started to walk away first because I think as you get older, you become more self-aware of the need you have for grace in your life and the need you have for truth in your life. And it changes you a little bit and you start to see this woman not as a bad person, but as maybe you. Your own sins put on her. The times where you've done things just as bad, even if it's only been in your own mind, as what she's done. The times that your heart has not been pure, the times that you have done something you're not proud of, and you are so grateful that yours just hasn't been as public as hers. And so they start to leave one by one until just Jesus is standing there with her. Do you remember what Jesus says? He said, where'd they go? Did they condemn you? And she says, no. And then he says those words, neither do I condemn you. But then he says, now go and leave your life of sin. I don't condemn you. Now go and leave your life of sin. That's a huge line. Which is it, Jesus? Like, which one is it? Which one is it? We want to know, right? Which one is it? I don't condemn you? Or the sin thing? Go leave your life of sin. You're calling it sin. You're saying it's sin. Which one is it? Is it I don't condemn you or go leave your life of sin? Which one is it? Is it grace or is it truth? Which one are we doing here, Jesus? And the answer from Jesus is yes. Yes. Absolutely. Go leave your life of sin. 100% do that. And then 100%, I don't condemn you. There is a difference, a big difference between being conservative and being condemning. Does that make sense? There's a big difference. Sometimes we get the two terms confused, where we think that because we have conservative values or we are conservative people, that somehow, and people assume this about us, if we have conservative views, that somehow we are condemning people. It doesn't have to be that both in the same thing. You can be conservative without condemning. And Jesus holds his conservative values right here. Go leave your life of sin. Don't do that anymore. Stop it. But on the other side, he says, and I don't condemn you. Grace and truth. A few years ago, I was doing videos for baptisms at a church, and we were doing these videos and doing testimonies of people talking before they would do their baptisms, right? And we had different people that were coming through that were going to get baptized. And we had this group of folks. Some of them were, some were just people that had lived a pretty good life, and now they were getting baptized to live a little bit better life. Some were kind of in that place where they'd been really far from God, and they were kind of coming back. And then we had a group of folks that were coming right out of rehab into this baptism, and it was awesome. And we had a group of folks, they were coming out of this rehab background. And I'm shooting these videos, and a lot of people are telling their stories. They're telling their testimony of how they came to know Jesus and how they came to church and who led them on that path and the different things that had happened along the way. And I remember there was one guy who got up, his name was Alex, and Alex got up to the video and he sat down and he looked, and the first line he said, "Hi, my name is Alex. I'm a Christian and I'm an addict." And then he continued. That "and" I had never heard before. And it was so beautiful. I'm a Christian and I'm an addict. They're not mutually exclusive. Sometimes we live in both. And he talked about how he's recovering from his addiction and how he's trying to get out of that life, but how he is trying to follow Jesus it's just as difficult as leaving his addiction. He's trying to follow after a perfect Savior while trying to leave an addiction that has plagued him for his entire life. And doing both are very difficult, but the thing is, they don't have to be mutually exclusive. You can do both at the same time. You can try to walk away from an addiction while you are still following after Jesus. It's an and. You can do both. I'm a Christian and I'm an addict. I think Jesus, when he says these words, when he means by this, is he's saying that he is full of grace and truth. And as the church, we're supposed to do the same. John goes on at the end of this preamble here. I got to wrap up here. I apologize. He says this, out of his fullness, we have all received grace in place of grace already given. So John in chapter 1, he's still in the middle of this long prologue, and he says this, we have all received grace in place of grace already given. We've already been given grace once, but now we've been given grace again. And then he says, for the law was given through Moses. So we got the law from Moses, we got the grace from Jesus. We've been given grace, we've been given a law, but then he says, and truth came, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So we have grace given, we have truth given, we have law given, but suddenly grace and truth came. And the word he uses for came is different than the word from given. He says came, which means like begotten. It means born. It means birthed. He's saying grace and truth for the first time in the history of mankind was birthed into existence through Jesus. For the first time, both could coexist with one another, grace and truth. They could both live within one dwelling, and it was Jesus. And he says it was birthed. It was given flesh. Grace and truth was a word became flesh. It was now embodied in Jesus. And as Jesus embodies grace and truth, as Jesus' body, as the church, it is our job to embody both grace and truth. To hold people accountable when they need to be held accountable, but to forgive people when they need to be forgiven. To be the kind of people who would be able to say, go and leave that lifestyle, but at the same time, I don't condemn you for it. To be the kind of people who would embrace people who say, I am a Christian and I am an addict. If we would be those people, if we're that kind of church, I know it's messy, I know it's difficult, I know that it doesn't have a lot of blanket statements. It takes a lot of individual conversations. But that's the type of church and the type of people we are supposed to be. As Jesus embodied it, as his body, that's our job. Let's stand together. We're going to pray. And maybe there are people in your own life that you think of that need a full measure of grace or they need a full measure of truth right now. Maybe they're not fun. That's not a fun thing to think about. Maybe there's people in your life that you need to give a full measure of grace to. Maybe there are people in your life that you need to give a full measure of truth to. And I know how if you're wired like me, you really want to give somebody else the truth and you want to receive the grace. Okay, let's be honest with ourselves. But maybe there's some people that they need to receive the grace and maybe you need to receive that truth. Maybe that's how it works. As we get ready for this week, for Christmas Eve, and as we prepare ourselves for that, maybe there are people you need to extend that to. Maybe it's family, maybe it's friends, maybe people you're going to see over this time. I ask you to pray about who that might be or how that might look, that God would give you that Holy Spirit that allows you to know when to speak truth and when to give grace. Let's pray together. God, I thank you so much for sending your Son here to embody both grace and truth. Something we've never seen before. We've seen the law, we've seen grace given, but we've never seen grace and truth so well exhibited than by your Son. So God, I thank you so much for sending him, for allowing us to see a model in front of us of grace and truth. And God, I thank you for him because he extended it not just to the world around us, but to us individually, for being the kind of Jesus, the kind that would save us, that would give us his truth, that would teach us his ways, but also that would allow us the grace to follow after him. God, I thank you so much for that. And God, we all know where we stand today. I pray if there's truth that you need to speak into our lives, that you would speak it to us. God, if there's grace that we need to allow ourselves to receive, that you would allow us to receive it. And God, if there are people we need to speak truth to or we need to extend grace to, you would allow us to do that as well. I thank you for this season. God, I thank you for Christmas Eve. I pray that you would bless that service, bless that time together, bless our interactions with our family, with our friends as we go into this season together. Praise in your name.